So in last week's episode, we went over all things branding, from creating a mood board to choosing a color scheme and how to pick a font. In this week's episode, we're gonna go over all things designing, because in this series, we're designing a brand with no Photoshop experience. For someone who has no Photoshop experience, how would you even get started graphic designing for a clothing brand? Well, it's simple. There's thousands of people who specialize in graphic designing. We're simply going to find them, hire them, and pay them. In my personal experience, when I've hired a graphic designer, they really don't accomplish my vision, or they're way off the rocker.
Yeah.
How can you hire a graphic designer and ensure that they're going to deliver what you want? Well, first things first, you have to know that there are many different types of graphic designers. They come in many shapes, styles, and sizes. There's graphic designers who specialize in websites, logo design, and there's graphic designers who specialize in merchandising. So the first thing that you need to do when looking for a graphic designer is find the graphic designer that suits your particular project.
Nice.
If we're designing a logo, for example, we're gonna look for graphic designers that specialize in logo making. Awesome. So in the last episode, we created a mood board. Is that something you're supposed to send to the graphic designer, or what's that process look like? Well, typically you want to create a creative brief when you're talking with a graphic designer and you plan on hiring them. Before we get to that, it's important to know where to find the graphic designers first and foremost. And there are 3 resources that I can give to you. The first one that I recommend is a website called Fiverr, which I'll leave in the comment section below. The second one is called Upwork. And then the third one is called 99 Designs. These are 3 resources that we use for finding graphic designers, and it's where you can go for your next project. Another strategy you can use is searching up graphic designers as a hashtag on Instagram, and that will populate a whole bunch of options for you. Nice. And we know that we need to find a graphic designer that specializes in logo making. So for this series, we're going to use Fiverr. Fiverr is a marketplace for graphic designers that come from all around the world, and you can simply look for them by typing in graphic designer logo makers in the search bar. And there's a couple of rule of thumbs that we should follow and that I always follow. One is when you're hiring a graphic designer, you always want to make sure that they have a 4.7 rating or higher.
Okay.
And with at least 50 projects underneath the belt, because it's important that they have experience. I want my brand to look a certain way, and I want the graphic designer that I use to have the experience to match that. There was a specific look that we had when it came to logo inspiration, and that was that the logo should have some sort of negative space. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to type in graphic designer who specializes in negative space logos in order to find a graphic designer who can do exactly what I want them to do. So you mentioned a creative brief. What is a creative brief? So a creative brief is basically a set of instructions that you give to a graphic designer that kind of gives and details out the project per se. And some of the things that you want to include in a creative brief is, first and foremost, your name, your company name, the type of files that you'll be needing, your due date. And it's important that we circle back to our mood board. You want to be able to pull the logo inspiration from your mood board and be able to include that within your creative brief when you're hiring the graphic designer, so they have an idea and or a sense of style when designing your logo. And I find that oftentimes when you can pull the inspiration that you had from your mood board and include it into your creative brief when hiring the graphic designer, that they're usually right on the mark. You want to be able to see your logo in the colors that you've picked out and selected. So what is the general turnaround time you can expect from a graphic designer? Is it 2 days? Is it 1 week? 3 weeks? I like to think of graphic designers as tattoo artists. There's graphic designers that are highly sought out and oftentimes maybe have a longer turnaround time as a result. Typically what I'm happy with, if I can order a project from Fiverr and get it back within 3 to 5 business days, usually that's sufficient enough for me, where it gives the graphic designer enough time to be able to work on the project, as well as also balance out the fact that maybe they have other projects they're working on. Is there a certain budget you should factor in when it comes to graphic design? What's the typical project price look like? So, that's kind of like a touchy subject, and I'm gonna go back to the tattoo artist perspective. It's not so much about what I'm willing to pay the graphic designer, but more so that I look at my overall budget and see what I can overall afford for my brand, and I try to allocate a percentage of that to the logo creation. For a good rule of thumb for the viewers listening, I think the logo is one of the most important staples of the brand. Sometimes I try to aim for 10% of the budget for the logo per se, because for me, that's the staple of the brand and typically the most important when creating your new designs and your website. So in this series, we talked about having a budget of $2,500. A 10% budget would be $250 that I would allocate for the graphic design services of my logo, and maybe I can sneak in a t-shirt design in there by negotiating with him. So we showed you tips on how to hire a graphic designer, how we hired a graphic designer, and in next week's episode, we'll show you what we come up with. On top of that, we'll go over some different product recommendations for your next clothing brand.